when we think about the impact of the decisions that the Federal Reserve makes on the money supply, we want to also take a look at what impact does that have on banking and the overall economy, because it ends up having a huge ripple effect. In the short run, the monetary policy changes that are introduced, particularly in regards to money supply, are going to have a short-run impact on interest rates. That's where you're going to see the impact first. But in the long run, the impact tends to be measured in terms of inflation. So if you increase the money supply or you decrease the money supply, you're having an impact on inflation. And historically, we see this over and over again. What happens when in the late 1700s, the Continental Congress decides to print continental dollars? Well, guess what? It leads to a sharp period of inflation early on in our nation's history. In the 1860s, when the federal government decides to print greenbacks to help put more currency into the economy to help offset the costs of the war, inflation begins to rise during that time as well. So one way that the Federal Reserve has figured out how to kind of balance the interest rates and to help offset some of the costs that go along with money supply issues is what's called monetizing the debt. By monetizing the debt, they are essentially trying to pump more money into the economy to offset any deficit spending that's going on in order to keep interest rates from changing. So if we go to deficit spending because we have a major event going on, like for instance, we're going to talk about what was happening during the 1960s, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War led to deficit spending, and in order to offset that deficit spending, the Federal Reserve began to pump more money into the economy. And they were hoping to offset the deficit spending by adding more currency into the market, just enough so that it could actually keep interest rates approximately the same. And you can do this in the short run. In the short run, it won't have a huge impact. It'll keep interest rates approximately the same. But if you continue to repeat these short-run efforts, eventually in the long term, you're going to see inflation. And that's exactly what we see happen. Over the 1960s, the late 1960s into the early 1970s, this was the pattern. So let's take a look at what was happening from the 1960s through the 1980s when it came to monetary policy. As I mentioned, in the 1960s and 70s, we were fighting in the Vietnam War, a very expensive, long, drawn-out conflict that the United States is involved in. And in order to offset this, they monetized the debt, and they began to increase the money supply. From the late 1960s through the 1970s, you were seeing money supply growth rate annually of about 12%. No big surprise then when we get into the 1970s that we begin to see inflation rates begin to rise. And President Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter both had to struggle with the inflation that was taking over the U.S. economy in the 1970s. In large part, economists are going to point back to the short-run efforts that were done during the late 1960s and early 1970s to offset the Vietnam deficit spending. But policy begins to change in the 1980s. The Federal Reserve stopped money supply expansion. They said, we can't keep doing these short-run efforts to pump more money into the economy. We have to deal with interest rates, and we're going to have to constrict the money supply. So what happens? In the 1980s, as this policy is introduced, interest rates begin to climb. By 1981, the prime interest rate was 21.5%. Put that in perspective, our interest rates in early 2023 were around 8%. So 21.5% interest rates are very high. It makes it very difficult to take out money to buy a car. It makes it very difficult to buy a home. Mortgage rates in the early 80s, throughout the 80s, were very, very expensive because the Federal Reserve decided that they were going to constrict the money supply. Now, when it comes to monetary policy, it isn't a surefire system to happen right away. It doesn't always work right away. Sometimes it might take 6 months and you see changes begin to take effect, but it could also take a couple of years before you actually start to see the changes begin to take effect. And the other thing to keep in mind is that monetary policies don't affect everybody the same. Some businesses depend on borrowing money a lot more than other businesses. And so if you're one of those businesses that depends on borrowing money, and the Federal Reserve is making it more difficult for you because of their monetary policy to borrow money, if interest rates are beginning to rise and it's becoming more expensive for you to borrow money, then that's going to hit those businesses a lot harder. Businesses that don't rely on borrowing money as much are going to not face those same consequences. So the impact of the burden isn't even across the society. It's going to impact different industries, different individuals in different ways.